Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host Scott Parkin in Berkeley, California today, and as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in Ohio.
Yep. Today, we're going to be talking about a new book that at the intersection of environmental justice and disability rights and many other things. Today, we're talking with Professor Sunaura Taylor, who is a professor at the University of California at Berkeley in the Environmental Science Policy and Management Department. And also author of a new book, Disabled Ecologies, Lessons from a Wounded Desert. Professor Taylor, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Oh, thank you both so much for having me. I'm so excited to get an opportunity to talk about my new book.
Yeah, I was in Mo's book on Telegraph yesterday and saw it on the shelves.
No, really?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's so exciting. I have yet to actually see it in the wild. That's thrilling.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like, oh yeah, I'm talking to her tomorrow.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and so the book it talks about Tucson, Arizona, and it talks about pollution of this aquifer by Hughes Aircraft. And then you tie a couple of different pieces together, which is around disability rights and around the wounded ecology of the Sonoran Desert and some of the abuses by Hughes. And so we have many questions and many ways we're going to go with this, but maybe actually just talk first about how you came to write this book.
Absolutely. Happy to do that. First, for your viewers, I like to start any sort of events that I do or conversations that I do with an access check. And also, since there will be visuals, an audio description of myself and its disability best practices. So I'm a white woman in my 40s. I use a power wheelchair. I'm in a messy office. And I don't use my arms. So you might see me reaching over and grabbing a glass of tea to sip and such things like that. So that's me. And I'm sure at different points, access will come up in this conversation. So it's always part of a disability sort of practice and method to talk about those kinds of things. Yeah, so the question of where this book came from and emerged, this is one of those books that I always knew that I was going to write. I didn't know exactly what it would entail or look like, but I always had a feeling that I would return to this story and these ideas. And the reason for this are a few. The most obvious is that I was raised with the understanding that my own disability, which is a disability from birth, was related to the pollution and contamination on the south side of Tucson that I tell the story of. And so I always knew that I wanted to go back to Tucson. We moved when I was 6. I always knew that I wanted to go back and better understand what happened in Tucson. But the reason why I wanted to write about this was not actually that I wanted to delve into my own personal story, but more that being raised with that story really impacted my understanding of what would become 2 of my obsessions, disability and environmentalism. And with being raised with this story that pollution, and specifically defense industry pollution, was the cause of my disability, gave me an understanding that disability is not just this individualized medical problem that was my own problem, right? It gave me a sense that disability is always political, it's always relational, it can impact whole communities, and that it is essentially a social justice issue, right? And then in terms of my understanding of environmentalism, I always had this understanding that injury to nature is really injury to human beings, right? And so really trying to think about bringing the health of nature and the health of people together. And so those interests, those kinds of obsessions of mine about those 2 concepts and what they mean, I would say that those kind of really are what started the book or started the project. And then I knew I wanted to root these kind of broader conceptual ideas to a place. And of course, returning to the place that had impacted me personally made the most sense. So it's one of these things that has been with me for a really long time. The actual creation of the book, from research to writing, it's been a long time. It's been about 8 years. So I'm very happy to actually see it out in the world.
And how you talk about this in the book, and you just mentioned it, you as a young child, and you were born in the Tucson area. I'm wondering if you could actually talk a little bit about how it did affect you personally, the Superfund site related to Hughes.
Yeah, of course. One of the things that I share about in this book, or that I explore in this book, is that the burden of proof is always on the people to prove that, yes, my health condition, or the community's health condition, can be correlated specifically to this one site. And I actually really interrogate that whole methodology in the book, because of course that's an impossibility. It's an impossible thing to prove because of the limits of science, of the way in which we understand the interactions between toxins and all these things. And it's a way of keeping community, and I would say people, disabled and ill people injured by pollution, sort of perpetually in a state of self-doubt of, is this actually right? Is it my own fault that I'm sick? And so there's all kinds of questions like that I really interrogate throughout the book. With that said, I was born with a disability nearby the contamination. And yeah, my family always, I grew up with this story that the contamination was the cause of my own disability. We were part of the litigation. And all of these things are also complicated by the fact that we were a white family, and my father had just moved there to go to graduate school. So we were new to the area. We moved into this neighborhood, and like many upwardly mobile families, moved away as soon as we found out that there was contamination, right? So I wasn't part of the ongoing decades-long struggle of the community for justice. And that's also something that I try to think through in telling this story of, I'm both impacted and also in many ways to this community. Yeah.
So your family was already aware that there was something going on environmentally. Were there already early on those efforts to make somebody responsible for that, and how were those met?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the reasons why, actually, after I started researching this history, one of the reasons why I got so committed to telling this story is that this is really one of the earliest environmental justice movements in the US. And their story is to some extent well known in Tucson, but really hasn't been shared more widely. And they were they made incredible successes. So I really wanted to tell this story. And so I'll just give a short kind of overview of what happened, which is essentially that in the late 1940s, various sort of aircraft industries moved into the south side of Tucson. Hughes Aircraft moved in 1951, started dumping huge amounts of toxins, heavy metals. The solvent trichloroethylene became associated with the site. And these toxins seeped into the groundwater, as of course they will, and they slowly moved with the groundwater into the drinking wells of the Southside community, a largely Mexican-American community. By the time it came to be exposed and to the public, it was a largely Mexican-American community. In 1985, a local investigative journalist who had been following Hughes had a tip-off from another journalist who lived on the south side that people in the community were aware that something was wrong, right? Young high schoolers were getting testicular cancer, people were getting brain tumors, people were having miscarriages, babies born with disabilities, all sorts of things. So the people on the south side already knew that there was something wrong. And there was this amazing sort of collaboration between this journalist, Jane Kay, and some Southside community members. And within 3 months of those articles coming out, they had organized themselves into a really amazing environmental justice group called Tucsonans for a Clean Environment, which was very clever because it was TCE, which is the same acronym as for trichloroethylene. Yeah, so there was an awareness within the community, right, far before it actually came into the public spotlight.
And there's the aquifer in Tucson is impacted by this, and it's impacting this local community on the south side of Tucson. But just maybe from an environmental perspective, can you actually tell us a little bit about the aquifer, just for the listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, a large portion of my book is centered around the aquifer. Also, I realized at a certain point in my research that even though I was reading all these things where the aquifer was the central sort of character in many ways, that I was also like, oh, I don't actually, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a hydrogeologist. I don't really actually know very much about aquifers or really what an aquifer is. So I spent a lot of time, and quite a bit of this book is also my sort of getting to know the aquifer, which to me felt as a now permanently contaminated, permanently altered body of water, I became to feel a sense of solidarity with as a sort of another disabled entity in some level. Yeah, at the time of this contamination, Tucson depended completely on ground and for drinking water. There were lots of claims once the contamination came to light that, by Hughes Aircraft and other industries, that they didn't realize that there was groundwater there, that it would seep into the groundwater, which is just ridiculous because they also simultaneously had drinking wells. So everyone depended on drinking water. And so this was a major sort of event at the time in Tucson, because this was it was not exactly known how dangerous it was, what the extent of the contamination was. And so one of the things that I come to understand with aquifers is that they are, of course, they're ecosystems entangled with other ecosystems. And so they're entangled with the above ground water, with snowmelt, with rainwater. And so all of those kinds of connections and entanglements need to be thought about when we're thinking about how to treat or remediate the groundwater as well. Lots to say about the aquifer. I got obsessed with it.
It's definitely an essential character in the book.
Yeah.
That's why I was asking the question.
Yeah.
We have more questions about the community's impact and stuff, which you've already touched upon. But before I go there, I'm wondering if you could actually talk a little bit about the impact of the contamination on the sort of non-human members of the system there, the ecosystem there. Like, what kind of impact was this contamination having on wildlife or on plant life, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first came to Tucson to start interviewing people and looking for impacts, I asked a variety of scientists who were studying this site, other kinds of people, hydrologists, what were the impacts on non-human life? And actually, most people said, there weren't really any paths of exposure to ecosystems or to wildlife. And so it really just impacted the human beings who were drinking the water. So this never quite sat right with me. I was like, what? This doesn't make sense. And so thinking about it and trying to make sense of that analysis compared to what I was reading in the archive, I realized that this had everything to do with these sorts of experts that I was talking to, with their own definitions of what nature is, right? They were like, this was an industrial landscape, so it didn't really impact nature. But actually, of course, it's a desert ecosystem. So the pollutants that would overflow these pools of toxic waste would seep into the groundwater, but also would flow through the desert washes, would be drank up by cattle. There's stories in the archive of the Tohono communities, cattle drinking this water and dying. There's stories in the archive, complaints actually from people who worked at Hughes, that despite this idea that this was an industrial site, that all sorts of desert animals would come up to these pools looking for water and would drink contaminants and die. There's stories of Southsiders themselves who say that they'd water their plants and they'd die when they watered them, or that their cats and dogs or farmed animals became sick So one of the things that this isn't on one level, this isn't the spectacular kind of site to explore, right? This isn't a forest that has been just incredibly injured, or a river, right? This is a little bit more of, this is a site that pushes us to think about what we mean when we talk about nature, or what we talk about in the more than human world. But the more I looked, of course, the more actually non-humans and ecosystems were everywhere. And then, of course, the aquifer, which also had not been thought of as an answer to that question, because aquifers are often thought about really as essentially part of our infrastructure, right? They're thought about in terms of their output and how much water they can yield and stuff. But the aquifer, again, is also completely entangled with the broader sort of ecological and water cycles of Tucson.
And the aquifers weren't covered by government regulations, because this is a period, by this time you have the EPA, you have the Clean Water Act, and I think, what did you say, that those mostly affected waters that had commercial purposes or something like that?
Yeah, so I didn't realize this until, again, researching, but so aquifers are not covered by like the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act really covers only navigable waters, those waters that we could have a vessel on, which is such a strange kind of old-fashioned way of thinking about what water needs to be protected. So aquifers are really, as far as my understanding goes, really are mostly protected as groundwater, right, through the Safe Drinking Water Act, but it's not aquifers as ecosystems. One of the things, so that means, for example, that an aquifer that has been overdrawn, that can no longer reach the ecosystems above, the rivers above and stuff like that, that's a hard, from an environmental policy perspective, that's a hard thing to protect, because the aquifer isn't being protected as an ecosystem. It's just being legislated under for water quality, essentially. Yes, which in this moment, when there's just, our world's aquifers are in extreme crisis from depletion, from contamination, really thinking about that definition of a water body and which water bodies get to be protected, or even by our measly, not thorough enough laws, are something that we really need to think about, because aquifers are not covered under the Clean Water Act.
It's so disturbing to think about that.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that we have the Clean Water Act is to protect communities from what these vessels would do to navigable waters. But I'm wondering, you touched on some of the health impacts on the local community, but just to tell us a little bit about this community on the south side of Tucson, and how what other ways in which they were impacted by this contamination, by this pollution, by Hughes. And by the way, just for reference, Hughes is now Raytheon, correct? Is that
Hughes
right?
is now Raytheon, which right after my final round of edits actually changed its name again to RTX.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yes. So in this book, I still call Raytheon, but it's actually RTX. And there's a whole conversation there around, of course, like war industry contamination and just
we've done several episodes about war, profiteers, and Raytheon.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. So y'all know. Yeah, so the question about the community. So from the 40s through 50s, this was a really rural area. It was actually quite mixed race. And people were moving to the area increasingly because Hughes offered good paying jobs and benefits, right? So this was actually quite a mixed race community, on some level, still quite rural. But again, by the time Jane Kay, the journalist, actually wrote these articles in 1980, and the pollution came into the public conversation, the community then was largely Mexican American. And so the response to the contamination from city officials, from the EPA, from the responsible parties, was really just extremely negligent, basically, in terms of the actual people who were impacted. The city and the EPA first became aware of the contamination in around 1980. And so there were 5 years in between when the contamination was known about, when the first well closed, but before these articles were written. During that time, there was all sorts of effort to figure out who was responsible for this contamination, even though it was very obvious that it was Hughes, but all this hand wringing around that. And other aspects of the site's geohydrology and stuff were trying to be figured out, but no attempt was made to figure out who drank that water. And no attempt was made to tell the community that water had dangerous levels of contaminants in it. And so when it finally came to light, one would think that it would be okay, people would try to cover their tracks, and at least then they would try to look into where this water went and who had served it. Instead, there was this extremely racist, ableist narrative that these weren't dangerous levels of contaminants, that this was paranoia, and that the community did have disproportionate health impacts, but these health impacts were because of the community's lifestyle, or because they were genetically predisposed to illness. And it's this really awful to narrate, but really intensely remembered moment for the community of a city official actually telling the community that they were sick because of the beans and chilies they ate. So they were not only dealing with the impacts of illness or caring for sick family members or dealing with illness themselves, but then also dealing with this, what today we would clearly see as just blatant environmental racism. But there wasn't that language at that time, or maybe the very beginnings of it. And which is all the more amazing that then they really organized and immediately fought back again within 3 months. They were calling for city officials' resignations. They were calling for a whole expansive array of things. Oops.
Bob, you're muted.
I always forget to do that. What was the initial response from the kind of local authorities, who I assume are like really in close quarters with Hughes? Did it take a while to get people just to listen?
Again, it was negligent. So there's a few people. I tell the story of a hydrologist who worked at the Arizona Department of Health, who was actually really one of the first people who discovered the contamination through a EPA program. He and another hydrologist their job basically this would have been late 70s, was to search for potential contamination sites in Arizona. And this was something that was happening all over the country. And there had already been these whispers, these not even whispers, letters of complaints from Tohono O'odham representatives from water department against Hughes's contamination. So they knew to go there. And this hydrologist who I spoke to for this project was in the plane when they flew over in Hughes and saw these just enormous waste lagoons that were seeping into the groundwater. And he did his best in the position that he was in to get this information out there, was talking to journalists and such. But on a broader scale, the city officials, again, were just negligent. There wasn't a sort of looking into where this water went. There were a lot of excuses. A lot of the water was probably mixed in larger reservoirs and then served. It was diluted. It wouldn't be a problem. That kind of narrative. And then there was a lot of struggle because Hughes didn't want to take the blame. So Hughes was blaming all these much smaller companies, even though, again, every common sense pointed to them.
I'm guessing that Hughes hired some fancy public relations firm also to help them when this story went more public, which is par for the course with these companies.
Yeah. I print in the book a few glossy, they don't look glossy in the book because they're black and white, but the actual original document in the archive is this sort of glossy handout from Hughes. That's basically, at the time, all the companies were using these chemicals and had the same sort of disposal methods. And we didn't know that it would cause problems, but now we've learned our ways and we're going to make it better. But they totally had this spin on the story, which is completely false, because they actually hired lawyers to keep their own findings out of the hands of the EPA and stuff. Yeah, there's lots to say there too.
The community group TCE, it sounds like they ran a pretty effective community organizing campaign to raise this. I'm wondering if you could actually just talk about some of that a little bit. Who was it led by? What were some of the strategies and tactics in which they used?
Yes, it was led by, there were a lot of educators, a lot of school teachers, some of them, and some employees from Hughes. Melinda, who at the time, she was Melinda Gonzalez, now Melinda Bernal, was educator and also had been a union organizer. And so she was really a central organizer in the beginning. She actually got her husband, who had gone to law school, had not studied environmental law, had not studied tort law, but she was like, you need to get involved in this case and you need to teach yourself this other kind of law so that we can do what we can for the community. And that's a sort of a separate story, but he actually did go on working with some other lawyers and had some very successful cases for the community. But Melinda Bernal, Eduardo Quintana was an employee at Hughes, also, I believe, had done some union work, and various others later, a woman named Rose Augustine, who would bring the movement more into more national conversation around environmental justice. And there were so many others, but these are some of the main people who I talk about throughout throughout the book. They're some of the main people I follow. So at the beginning, the only way that they had to fight back was with their stories, right? And so they collected their stories. They put out hundreds of surveys and went door to door, knocking door to door, and collected people's information about what they were experiencing. They eventually, they had a list of, I don't know if they would call them demands, but essentially they were aquifer protection, better aquifer protection regulation, again, firing of these negligent and racist city officials. They wanted official health survey and health studies to be done. They wanted a health clinic, which eventually they actually did manage to get for a while, funding for health services for those impacted by TCE, and numerous other things that just they really had this expansive idea of what justice would look like in this moment. It wasn't just about let's win a legal battle, but that was also a really important part of it. And they did win a historic groundwater case. At the time, it was the largest settlement for groundwater pollution. And they continued to organize throughout the 90s. And even still, when I returned to start exploring and learning more in 2017, there were still community members organizing, attending these meetings, making sure that the aquifer is being cared for, trying to demand that the health of the community is still an issue. It's really also been ongoing. It's not just the TCE movement in the 80s. And 90s, there's been many iterations and individuals involved, but the portion of the story that I tell focuses on that early movement.
Oh, go ahead.
You go ahead.
So you talk about factors like poverty and ethnicity in this particular environmental catastrophe, but the title is Disabled Ecologies, and you talk about disability as well. And I take it, because normally I would think about the actual health consequences of a particular situation, but I think you mean more than that. So how do you integrate this idea of disability with the way we study our natural world?
Yeah, I think one of the things on a really basic level that this book is trying to do, besides tell this amazing story of these community organizers, is to make the case that disability and related sort of ideas, illness, disease, health, that these concepts are really important to how we think about and how we respond to environmental issues. And part of why I'm making that case is that disability and illness are already everywhere within the arena. And so even just looking at this site, we can follow the trails of disability or illness, which is essentially what I mean when I would say a disabled ecology, is really following these trails of injury, whether we're talking about actual disabilities and illnesses that impacted human communities or impacted non-human animals, entered the aquifer, but also the sort of the ways in which disability and illness and health kind of float around the narratives that are told around about the site. And we can see this whether we're looking at, again, the way that disability and illness are used to cover up the racism of city officials in their, oh, we're not being racist, it's just that they have health conditions and that. But we can also look at how disability and illness are used in both sides of the litigation. We can look at how they're used in by community members themselves as actually a form of evidence and a way of actually spurring action. So there's all these ways in which narratives of health and injury are emerging. And that's really what I'm following and naming when I'm naming disabled ecologies, is actually like a way of mapping both physical impacts, but also these narratives, right? But so on a broader level, we can see this happen within the environmental arena in general. We can see in popular nature writing all these metaphors that are used about the ecosystems, the Earth's life systems collapsing, or the Earth dying, or scarred landscapes, or all these sorts of metaphors that are essentially pointing to some sort of illness or disability. But for me, what is like most, yes, we need to think about these things, is that if we look at the environmental science arena, scientists are studying soil health, they're studying forest health, they're studying river health, they're studying ecosystem health. So if health is what environmental scientists are trying to achieve, trying to attain, then what is it that we have now? And to me, the language of disability and illness could be really helpful there, partially because disabled and ill communities, whether we're talking about disability rights and justice movements, or whether we're talking about environmental justice movements, that these communities have thought long and hard about what it means to live with disability and illness, and what justice looks like once that's already there. And so part of what I'm trying to do is show that disability is actually already part of this conversation. And if we leave it unmarked or depoliticized, then it can be used for all sorts of ends, some of which are going to be eugenic and exclusionary, and some of which, and so how to mark disability and politicize it so that we can turn it into something else.
Raises so many questions for me. The thing I'm thinking about is because I actually, in my day job, I do a lot of work with environmental justice communities and groups and things like that, which is, I feel like this sort of thought is definitely very strong in that community or community of communities or what have you. And then I think about the sort of what I call the, nonprofit industrial complex. And I would be curious about your thought, what you've seen, not just your thoughts, but what you've seen as far as like how the sort of Washington big greens or actually also the Bay Area big greens have, if they're in this mix at all, are they ignoring disability rights? Are they engaging in this at all?
Yeah, I think there's been, and I'm assuming by big greens, you mean like big environmental organizations, or yeah, okay.
I use a jargon called the nonprofit industrial complex. So.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think I got what you were getting at, and I just lost my train of thought 1 second. So I think that there's been a huge shift in the way that the sort of whatever we want to name as in a mainstream environmental movement is including other social justice issues. I don't think we're in the same position that we were in the 1970s when the Sierra Club did that survey of should they include other kinds of social justice issues in their work, racial justice issues, economic justice issues, and like a huge proportion, disturbing number of their their members were like, no, you shouldn't do that, right? Let's just focus on the environment, and environment has nothing to do with race or class or anything.
That's still a good portion of the Sierra Club membership today.
Yeah, it still is. But I'm willing to give some credit where credit due, that I think there's so much more of a diverse movement there's so many different kinds of environmentalisms and it is a much more sort of coalitional way of thinking. Is it perfect? Is it great? Absolutely not. But I think it's a little bit better. That is all to say that I think disability-wise, I think disability, again, is already everywhere within these movements, right? What environmentalists, to some extent, right, injury to the environment, damage to the environment, injury to human beings, damage to human beings, those are what environmentalists are trying to avoid, right? So disability is essentially the thing we are trying to avoid. That to me has to be thought about in a more complicated way, because we can't just say disability is this thing that we need to avoid. We have to say there's all of these people like disability A impacts everyone. There's no one who's untouched by disability. If you live long enough, you're going to become disabled. At this point, we all live in disabled environments. This isn't something that's just relegated to a handful of people who use wheelchairs, right? So much of the population has various health conditions, all sorts of things. But so what I am seeking from an environmental movement is an environmental movement that can point to those things and then be like, what do those already disabled, what do those people and ecosystems who are already disabled from these systems of exploitation, from systems of power, what do they need to live flourishing lives? Instead of this sort of like disability as this fear-mongering thing for the sort of able-bodied people who remain, right? Which I think is often more how disability is articulated. It's much more of a fear-mongering thing. And then the actual people who are already impacted are essentially abandoned. So I call these ableist ecologies in my book. And so I think part of what I want to highlight is the moments with environmental history, the moments within environmental movements where there's something else going on, where it's not an ableist ecology, where there is actually what I call an environmentalism of the injured, ill and disabled people or ecosystems being also part of the solution, part of the knowledge making for what it means. Like, how do we live disabled lives? Who knows how to do that but disabled people, right? And so I think I see disability as being a concept that's going to be increasingly more important as the sort of mass disablement of multi-species disablement of climate change and extinction and all the havoc that it's wreaking on human beings and non-humans becoming just increasingly evident to all of us. I see during this time, like disability and really becoming a really powerful signifier. And I think that we need to figure out which sort of path we're going to take, right? In ableist ecologies, that is essentially abandoning of those who are injured or seen as already inevitably going to become injured, right? Versus environmentalism of the injured, which also centers how to make good lives once you are injured. I don't know if that quite made sense, but
No, that totally made sense. I think we're getting close to time. I had one other question, which is kind of deviates from the book a little bit, but not totally. I love Tucson. I've spent some time there myself and spent time with a group there called No More Deaths, which is a group that does support for migrants crossing the border. They do things like water and supply drops in the desert, and they're often at odds with the Border Patrol. But I'm wondering, and so that kind of makes me think, I'm wondering what you see the connection talking about ecology and talking about disability, but I'm also wondering how you think migration fits into this as well, which it could also be not just human migration, but could also be like non-human migration as well. And one of the issues I see environmentalists raise when we talk about border walls is about how animals can't cross the border when there's a big wall there and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. There's so many different directions I think to take.
Right. It's a big question.
I think firstly, migration is an issue that's also completely entangled up with disability. In so many ways, the disabling aspects of that whole process of having to leave one place and trying to make it to another place. I think also so the first thing that occurs to me actually is going into the weeds of disability studies for a minute, but if you'll bear with me, disability studies, traditionally, early disability studies made a helpful distinction between disability and impairment. And they said impairment is like your material difference, the body that you're born in or the mind that you have that's just, it moves in certain ways or has certain kinds of conditions. And then disability is actually the barriers that are created from society, from structural barriers, from discrimination, from essentially steps. And as a really obvious example, it's And so I see also that clean definition has been really critiqued within disability community. But I still think it's a useful way of teaching tool. And I see that also as part of the thinking about the border wall, that is, or just all of these barriers that are created for people trying to cross, that these are disabling infrastructures, not only for, of course, not only for animals, but for people too, that the limitation of movement that racist and xenophobic sort of policies and actual structures create physically restricts one's ability to be mobile, right? To cross from point A to B. Or I'm thinking about your example of no more deaths, that No More Deaths is known for leaving water out in the desert, and then Border Patrol actually will go in, dump out the water and stab the plastic water bottles. I mean, just so awful. But that kind of also just kinds of disabling barriers, I think, that are created. Or those are just some of the things that I think about. How this particular contamination impacted those kinds of conversations are hard for me to exactly know. This was 40 years ago, and I think a lot of people who were undocumented did not want anything to, they weren't going to bring attention to themselves by joining the lawsuit, for example, or by, so that's another, right? There's even more vulnerability to these systems of exploitation, and when we see that in all sorts of industries, right? The taking advantage of people's vulnerability because they can't risk exposure in that way. So I think the one place that it became really kind of part of the conversation more clearly in the book is actually the organizing of Rose Augustine, and then in I think the 1990s, where she and another amazing organizer in Nogales, Teresa Leal, did these sort of toxic tours that really followed toxicity across the border and showed the impacts on both sides of the border. Toxicity flows freely, right? Unfortunately, but people and animals can't. So that was also a place where, she was an organizer that was really making those connections, and also making those connections to what it is that Hughes Aircraft as a defense industry was doing, right? Making missiles and essentially bombing other people's watersheds and people. So much there. So again, not sure if that was what you were thinking, but
that's what I wanted to get at. And it also sounds like it's a topic for another book if we want to talk about migration even more deeply.
Yeah.
I'm gonna leave it there. I want to thank you for joining us today. Folks, we've been talking with Professor Sunaura Taylor, who is a professor at UC Berkeley and also author of Disabled Ecologies, Lessons from a Wounded Desert. If you'd like what you're listening to, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on one of the many audio platforms we're on, give us a rate and review. And if you really like us, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit that support button and make a donation, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Professor Taylor, it's been really great talking with you today. Really enjoyed having you on today.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Everyone else, we will talk to you again soon, and make trouble and misbehave, and we'll see you soon.